On October 14th, 2008, the New York Times reported what was then some rare good economic news. For the first time that month, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had actually closed higher than it had opened. Indeed, as the headline trumpeted, the index had increased by 11% that day. What was the source of the good news? Well, of course, it's hard to know for sure, but Michael Grinbaum of the Times attributed it to a coordinated campaign on the part of governments and central banks throughout the world to unlock the global flow of credit. In simple terms, governments and central banks work together to try to get banks lending again. This lecture is about monetary policy coordination. We will learn what coordination means and why it is important. And we'll consider two types of coordination. First, I will explain the type of coordination where central banks of several countries agree to simultaneously change interest rates in the same direction. This is the type of coordination that occurred in October of 2008, which, according to the New York Times, was the source of large gains in stock prices. But I will also explain another type of coordination, the type of coordination implicit in the creation and operation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Now, you know that the IMF is often criticized, but today I'd like to suggest that the IMF is often misunderstood. We'll see when and why the IMF was created. We'll study the function of the IMF, and we'll consider why it is appropriate to think of IMF crisis interventions as a kind of cooperation among economies and central banks. Why is it important to think about cooperation among central banks? No economy, including the United States, is large enough or important enough or respected enough to go it alone in a world where funds move at the speed of light across international borders. Cooperation is not the policy equivalent of good manners. It's essential. No matter how sensible and important monetary policy coordination is, however, it does not always occur. In some cases, central bankers disagree about the relative importance of monetary policy objectives, and they do go it their own way. I will return to that very point at the end of the lecture. When central banks coordinate their monetary policies, they produce superior outcomes to the outcomes that could be achieved if those central banks worked in isolation. The news stories in October of 2008 pointed to a decision by the Federal Reserve and the central banks of Canada, England, Sweden, Switzerland, and the euro area to simultaneously announce reductions in interest rates as it became clear that a serious recession had begun. By coordinating their actions, the central banks were attempting to avoid changes in international exchange rates. Suppose the Federal Reserve had unilaterally lowered short-term interest rates. In that case, short maturity interest rates would have become lower in the United States than in Europe. What would have happened? Well, bank deposits would then have left the United States seeking higher rates in other countries. The demand and supply model that we considered earlier would represent this change as an increase in the supply of dollars to, for example, the dollar-euro market. And that model would predict a decrease in the euro price of the dollar. Put another way, the dollar would depreciate. So what? Well, suppose on the other hand that central banks cooperated and lowered interest rates at the same time and by similar amounts. Well, in that case, bank deposits do not leave the United States, or for that matter, any other country in search of higher interest rates, because there are no higher interest rates to be found. Therefore, there is no increase in the supply of dollars in the dollar-euro market and no depreciation in the dollar. Data show that the dollar did not depreciate in October 2008 as the Fed lowered interest rates and switched from a stance where inflation was a greater concern to a stance where recession was the greater concern. In fact, in late October, the euro price of the dollar rose from about 3/4 to about 0.8 of a euro for a dollar. Why did central banks want to keep the dollar from depreciating? Central banks and commercial banks and financial institutions in the respective countries hold large dollar deposits, and a decrease in the value of the dollar would have weakened their balance sheets, made their assets worth less. A fall in the value of the dollar would have made U.S. exports cheaper and would have started a competitive game among the nations, where each nation tried to soften the effect of the coming recession by raising exports at the expense of other nations. But by coordinating their actions, the central banks were attempting to assure financial markets that they understood the severity of the financial crisis and stood ready as a group to provide liquidity to financial institutions throughout the world. A coordinated effort by central banks is more likely to maintain and restore confidence in the global financial system than would be uncoordinated efforts. In situations where inflation is high, policy coordination is absolutely essential to reducing inflation at the lowest possible cost of foregone economic activity. The world faced a situation of high inflation in about 1980. Inflation rates were not simply high in the United States, they were high throughout the developed world. And we know that the Federal Reserve, under the chairmanship of Paul Volcker, took the initiative of implementing very restrictive monetary policy. The result was a decline in U.S. inflation over the coming years, but, as many believe, at the cost of a very serious recession. Economists Paul Krugman and Maurice Obstfeld have argued that inflation could have been reduced throughout the world at the cost of a milder recession, that is, at the lower cost, if central banks had coordinated their policies at the time. Krugman and Opsfeld liken the policy problem to what economists call a prisoner's dilemma game. In this game, we're going to suppose two players, home and foreign, our country and some other foreign country. We're going to assume that they have similar tastes. Both countries hate unemployment, and both countries hate inflation, but both countries are experiencing high enough inflation that they would be willing to suffer some increase in unemployment in order to get their inflation rates down. But, and this is crucial, both nations would like to experience the smallest gain in unemployment that would be possible. So, both home and foreign nations are going to choose one of two policies. Now, there are an infinite number of possible policies, but I'm only going to consider two here to make the point very clear. They can choose a somewhat restrictive policy, or they could choose a highly restrictive policy. The somewhat restrictive policy would mean a smaller increase in interest rates. The very restrictive policy would mean a larger increase in interest rates. So now, let's compare cooperation and non-cooperation between these two countries. In the non-cooperative, that is, no policy coordination game, both home and foreign will choose the highly restrictive policy. Let's see why. Suppose home has to move first, that is, initiate its policy first. And it has to choose either the somewhat restrictive or the very restrictive policy. Imagine first that home chooses the somewhat restrictive policy and raises its interest rates slightly. Well, then the foreign country will, in response, choose the highly restrictive policy because it will then be better off at the expense of the home country. Why? Because the foreign country will have an appreciating currency and the home country will have a depreciating currency. The appreciation of the foreign country's currency will further lower inflation there, while the depreciation of the home country currency will raise inflation at home relative to what it would have been. But notice, if instead the home country, which had to move first, which had to choose a policy first, would have chosen the more restrictive policy and raised interest rates by a lot, well, it's true that the foreign country could not transfer some of its inflation to the home country because it could not appreciate its currency relative to home. But nevertheless, the right thing for the foreign country to do is to pick the highly restrictive policy. And there was nothing about my argument that was unique to home moving first, so we would see the analysis was exactly the same, symmetric, if the foreign country had moved first. Conclusion? When they do not cooperate, when they do not coordinate, both home and foreign countries choose the highly restrictive policy. But imagine now a cooperative game where home and foreign countries coordinate their monetary policies and both find it optimal to choose the somewhat restrictive policy. Will that work? Well, keep in mind, inflation is lowered in both countries, but the recession in each country is milder than it would have been. Keep in mind that because they have coordinated, the exchange rate between the two countries does not change. So here, coordination of policy produces a clearly better remedy, a better way to lower inflation than any remedies that individual nations could obtain by going it alone. The key to coordination is to simultaneously implement policy in order to avoid changes in exchange rates. Talking about coordination leads us now to talk about the International Monetary Fund. Why? Well, the International Monetary Fund, often referred to as IMF, is an institution that provides for a coordinated approach to financial crises, especially financial crises that involve rapid depreciation of exchange rates. Now, as we've often seen, the IMF is often the target of angry protests. A case in point were protests in Greece to the austerity measures adopted by the Greek government and required by the IMF as part of an agreement to bail Greece out from its debt crisis in 2011. Where did the IMF come from? What's its origin? Well, the International Monetary Fund was created as part of the Bretton Woods system that reestablished fixed exchange rates after World War II. The original job of the IMF was to assist nations that experienced balance of payments crises, which occurred when financial market participants believed that a country's currency was overvalued at the agreed upon peg to the dollar. But after the world went to flexible exchange rates, floating exchange rates, in 1971 to 72, when the U.S. no longer pegged the price of the dollar in terms of gold, the IMF evolved. The IMF evolved to become an international lender to nations that were experiencing financial crises that could have dramatically lowered the exchange value of their currencies. In recent years, the IMF has assisted Mexico in 1994 to 95, several nations in East Asia in 1997 to 1998 during the so-called Asian financial crisis, and, as we've already seen, both Greece and Ireland during the subprime financial crisis that began in 2008. The IMF website explains that the IMF's job and its work entails three kinds of tasks. First, oversight of the world financial system and the financial and economic policies of its members. Now, as part of this job, the IMF collects and publishes data on the world's economies. Second, provision of technical assistance to countries to help them manage their economies. And third, and most important, international lending. The IMF website explains this last job in the following way, and I quote, "The IMF provides loans to countries that have trouble meeting their international payments and cannot otherwise find sufficient financing on affordable terms. This financial assistance is designed to help countries restore macroeconomic stability by rebuilding their international reserves, stabilizing their currencies, and paying for imports. All necessary conditions for relaunching growth." The IMF also provides concessional loans to low-income countries to help them develop their economies and reduce poverty." End quote. The IMF faces the same very difficult trade-off in fulfilling its role as an international lender that the Federal Reserve and any central bank faces in fulfilling its role as guarantor of the financial system and regulator of that same system. On one hand, loans from the IMF can save a nation's financial system when it's under stress during a financial crisis. Suppose, for example, there's a financial crisis in, let's say, Korea. Suppose the crisis begins with a recession that is quickly followed by a decrease in private lending to Korean banks and to Korean firms. Suppose that the crisis gains international attention when several Korean banks fail because they are unable to raise new funds sufficient to pay short-term debts that the banks have incurred in order to fund investment projects. As the crisis develops, deposits will flee Korea in search of safe havens and safe harbors. Depositors in Korea will remove funds from the crisis nation and move them to firms in stable economies, often the United States. The shift in deposits from Korea to the U.S. will clearly lead to depreciation of the Korean won. That's the name of the Korean currency. Korean depositors will increase the supply of won to the won-dollar market, and the dollar price of the won will fall. The fall in the won deepens the crisis for several reasons. Many Korean debts will be denominated in dollars, and those debts will become a bigger burden to Korea as the value of the won falls. Bank balance sheets in Korea will deteriorate as the probability for default increases. The won price of oil will increase, placing further pressure on the Korean economy. A loan from the IMF can make it possible for banks and other financial firms in Korea to pay their debts. With backing from the IMF, depositors will have less reason to remove their funds, and exchange rate stability will be restored. The won will probably not return to its pre-crisis level, but the dollar price of the won will stop falling. On the other hand, loans from the IMF in a financial crisis can cause moral hazard problems. If banks and other lenders in Korea understand that the IMF will step in during a crisis and rescue them, they have less incentive to engage in prudent lending practices. If the Korean central bank understands that the IMF will step in during a crisis and provide dollar loans to stabilize the won and the Korean economy, it has less incentive to oversee its banks in a diligent way. To mitigate the moral hazard problems while still assisting in a financial crisis, the IMF makes adoption of austerity measures a requirement for emergency lending. Austerity measures are not popular. The austerity measures for Greece were designed to force Greece to balance its government budget, and they included higher taxes, lower government spending, including lower spending for social programs, and mandatory interest payments on IMF loans. The austerity measures are often very unpopular and are the most immediate source of political unrest. The IMF plays an essential role in maintaining worldwide financial stability. Without the IMF, small financial crises could frequently turn into big financial crises. Speculators would have an incentive to sell currencies short in the hopes of making a profit when the crisis deepened and when the crisis country's exchange rate fell as a result. They would be like sharks constantly testing the weakness of nations. But with the IMF, speculators have smaller incentives to attack a currency because speculators typically will have smaller resources for offense than the IMF has to play defense. The speculators realize that their attacks could turn out to be highly unprofitable. The IMF exists because and only because of cooperation among the developed nations of the world. The IMF's resources come mainly from the money that countries pay as their capital subscription when they become members. Quotas broadly reflect the size of each member's economy. The larger a country's economy in terms of output, and the larger and more variable its trade, the larger its quota or subscription tends to be. The world's biggest economy, the United States, has the largest quota in the IMF. Quotas, together with the equal number of basic votes each member has, determine a country's voting power for IMF decisions. Quotas also help determine how much countries can borrow from the IMF. Today, we have thought about monetary policy coordination, but recognize that coordination does not occur automatically. It's constantly under threat. For example, the 2008 news story recounted that the coordination of policies between the European Central Bank and the Fed that began in 2008 came under threat in 2011 when oil prices began to rise as the result of political upheaval in Libya and elsewhere in the Mideast. The ECB worried about the inflationary effects of the oil price increases and leaned in the direction of tighter policy. The Fed worried about the recessionary effects of the oil price increases, lean the other way, in the direction of continued monetary ease. Keep in mind that the ECB has a different policy mandate than the Fed. Its mandate is to fight inflation, while the Fed's mandate is to fight inflation and maintain full employment. As oil prices began to increase and put upward pressure on prices in Europe and the United States, a real possibility existed that the ECB would raise interest rates while the Fed would continue to keep them low. If that occurred, we would predict that the euro price of the dollar would fall, providing additional stimulus to the U.S. economy at the cost to the United States of additional upward pressure on prices. Coordination of policy is important, but sometimes that coordination is a fragile thing. Thank you.